Welcome back to Lori's Dollhouse Rejuvenation. And today we're going to be working in this area right here, back to the front porch. I noticed what appeared to be wood rot at the base of the columns and the underlying structure holding up the columns on the front porch. So we're just going to kind of poke around and try to figure out really the scope of the project here. And what I found out was indeed this whole section needs to be rebuilt. So I decided to go ahead and rebuild it, but first I need to excavate and find out exactly what needs replaced up here. Is it just a repair or is it a complete rebuild of this whole front porch structure? So I usually compare this to being a dentist, kind of excavating out the cavities. Unfortunately, there's no money in this like maybe dentistry might offer. But nonetheless, we got to get all the decay out of here. So I'm just kind of taking my time. I'm using a Harbor Freight pry bar here, and I sharpened the edge just to cut through the material just a little bit quicker. But I'm going really slow. You want to be very gentle and only take out the rotted material. I do want to leave anything that's good behind and try to salvage that. So I'm trying to be methodical here and not tear away too much at one time, but really just get down to the root of the issue here and the root of the problem. And you can see it's going to be pretty nasty and it's going to be quite a rebuild. And it's going to extend up into these columns. And as far as I can tell, it's really just the base, maybe the first 3 or 4 inches of each column. So I'm going to prop the porch up. The whole corner of the porch gets propped up so that I can cut away the whole bottom portions of these columns. So I'm going to cut away the base of each of these 2 columns because they are just all rotted out. And I'm using a multi-tool with a flat blade, and I'm just going to follow a line, basically just where the rot stops. After I cut that line around each column, I'll just pry all the dead material out of there. After I cut that straight line into each column, I will continue the excavation and just pry all of the dead material out of there. And once again, the corner of the porch is supported by that post and the jack, so I know I can take all of this out and be safe. What I don't know is how well this column is attached up above me. So I am going slow. The column isn't that big or that heavy if it were to detach from the top of the porch. But nevertheless, I'm trying to be cautious. And as it turns out, each of the columns are fairly well supported and attached up above. And as a side note, you can see the older columns to the left on the ground. From a previous video, those columns were much larger and that was a much bigger project. You can watch that as well if you're interested. Once again, I'm taking my time on the excavation, but also kind of making a game plan as to my next steps. Like, how do I rebuild this? I'm pretty confident that I can. I mean, otherwise you'd have to be nuts just to do this without a real plan or without confidence that you can put it all back together. So, but I am strategizing. Is that a word? Strategizing? I'm strategizing about how to put all this back together. Once again, I feel pretty good about what I'm getting into here. So here it's completely torn down and you get a good look at really the scope of what I need to rebuild. So what is left is actually solid wood. So a lot of it is old and original, or at least just old and semi-original, maybe rebuilt in the last X amount of years, I'm not sure. But it's solid, so that's what I'm after. So I'm gonna glue all this and screw it back together and then start the rebuild process. So I'm carefully cutting and measuring all of the new pieces for the rebuild. And then I'll glue and brad nail this whole thing back together. Now for the column bases, I did get creative. I looked at replacing the entire columns. I looked at replacing just the bases. But what I came up with is I could create a design myself that is very close to the original. And these are just all round plaques from both Michaels and Joann Fabrics, actually. And I like the lines of these, I like the contours of these, and I know that I'll glue them, and I did end up tacking them with brad nails in the end, but I was confident that the weight of the columns and the ports were just going to hold them all together, and really once they're wood glued, they're kind of one piece. And here I'm working on the base of the column. So once again, I'm matching the existing columns and putting it all back together so that it all matches what was originally there. And just a look at the profile. And I will sand on this just a little bit, and then in the end, caulk and paint will smooth out all of the edges. So items like these tend to be a little bit easier when you paint them in place. So I'm going to go ahead and paint those guys in place. I'll install those, and you can look just above the piece I'm working on now, and you can see that they've been installed. And I've actually lowered the porch back onto the columns, and they are full weight bearing. And you can see the caulk and paint process on this entire rebuild portion has begun. And of course I'll speed that up because that's super boring, but you get the idea. And I am a big fan of caulk paint and caulk again to smooth out a lot of the edges, but also mostly to keep the water out. And water was the culprit in the first place that kind of wrecked this entire area. And here's a side-by-side of the demolition and then the entire area that I rebuilt. And here's the finished product. Now I feel like eventually I will need to do this to the remaining 3 posts and the other support columns, but for now they're stable, there is no wood rot, and it's a very close match. So I am happy with the way it turned out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.